All right, so we left off with the question of what is a species? And there's some gray areas, and that was something I was hoping to instill on you, and that scientists, in order to define species, have come up with some different what are called species concepts. And there are many species concepts, but the two that we're focused on in this chapter are the morphological species concept, which is based on just what that body looks like. So we used our polar bear and our grizzly bear as our examples. Morphological species concept, they're definitely different species because they look so very different from one another. Their bones are different, their skin is different, their facial features are different. Their size is different. All of these different qualities that would make them different species. However, there's also the biological species concept, which has to do with if a species can breed together in nature. And that becomes kind of dodgy because when you look at the polar bear and the grizzly bear in nature, until recently, they just never came into contact with each other because of the environments they live in are so vastly different. However, recently, it's happened. Polar bears and grizzly bears, as grizzly bears move north to into polar bear habitat, polar bears even moving further south, you have interactions between these two bears, and you have offspring being produced, as you saw in the video. So what is that? And that creates some issues because morphologically they're different, but biologically, before, when they never came into contact with each other, we could say they're definitely different species. Now that they're actually coming together in nature, they're creating what are called hybrids. And hybrid zones are interesting in nature. And that's the thing about species. We as humans like to categorize things, and we like to make, as you saw when looking at that book, all of those different species have different names, and they're all categorized. And even when we were looking at our trees that we looked at before we got sent home, on that lab where you guys were building trees for different species based on traits that they had. I can put a link to that just to remind you of what that is. That's, classifying things. It's saying, okay, we've got these distinct species and they're different from each other. I want to point out another type of species that is of interest. It has a fancy, pretty name. Let me get that straight for you. It's called a ring species. And I guess we could call that a species concept. Because, like we were mentioning, life isn't so black and white as we might think. In a ring species, we have a phenomena that is linked together by gene pools that are linked together. So I like to give an example of a shore bird, a bird that likes to live along the coast. And I'm going to do my Gulf of Mexico here, and Mexico, and maybe go down to South America. This is a terrible drawing. Apologies. And then back up. And then we'll have Baja California and all the way up into Canada. So, that's supposed to be North America. And this is supposed to be South America. All right, but back to my story about ring species. There are, as it turns out, species of birds that live way up here in the northern part of North America. And those birds are very similar to populations that are geographically close to them. And we have mating that goes on all the way along the coastlines. from north to south. And so we could kind of color code these and say, oh my gosh, here you've got birds that are very closely related to each other in unison over kind of a linear, because it's a shoreline, it's sort of a linear space. And that goes all the way down and around South America, back up to Canada on this other side. So when we look at these species, they're closely connected with each other genetically when they're right next door to each other. But what happens is, even though this gene pool is connected all the way around, this dude here, and this dude here are so different from each other. I mean, obviously, they're different. See what I'm saying? It gets difficult because this is clearly a united gene pool all the way around, but it's not, in the sense that they're only connected with the ones that are close to them. So this dude here and this dude over here, although they share the same gene pool, technically, they're so far apart that the genes don't match up anymore. And so we could say that this is a species here, and this is a species here, and perhaps that's a species here, and that's a species there. But they're all kind of connected to each other. And that's a ring species for you. It's a situation where you have what's clearly a different species here and a different species here or there, but close by, they're neighbors. They're all connected to each other genetically. So we are going to leave that out there for you to realize that there's some gray areas out there in biology. Okay, our next topic is to talk about, I believe this is, is to talk about isolating mechanisms. And isolating mechanisms lead to speciation because, once gene pools become separated from one another, they can wander off in different directions. So isolating mechanisms. And we can call that speciation. Your book, which I don't know if you have a copy at home with you or not, but even if you don't, I can put a link in to an online textbook so you can review through and read aside from the lecture if you choose to. So speciation is when one species, CIES, becomes two or more. And we saw this back in the horse lab when, if you'll recall, we had one horse and then at some point there was a division, and that ended up causing different lines on the family tree for the horses. Well, every time there's a division, that would be a type of speciation or speciation event that leads to a new species. So there are two main ways that speciation occurs, and they're known as allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. And allopatric, you can think of it this way, is where you have something that divides your gene pool. So you went from having a gene pool where everybody was all together in one, but then maybe something comes in and divides that gene pool permanently. And that permanent division causes the gene pools to wander off into different directions, but they're separate from each other. They're isolated. Oh, let me figure out how to make this. There we So allopatric speciation is caused or can be caused when species are isolated from one another. Some kind of barrier prevents them from being able to breed, and so they become two separate populations. So that's allopatric speciation. Sympatric speciation is where a species will remain connected to one another, and yet they move off in two different directions. And this is very interesting. We can talk about how this might occur over the next few days. Sorry, got a little cough, as usual. All right, so in sympatric speciation, populations remain connected to one another. Okay, I am going to then begin with a series of examples of allopatric speciation. And primarily, I want to talk about geographic barriers. Geographic barriers can be all kinds of things, and they have to do with habitat. So they could be, say, mountains. I happen to know mountains, and we see this where we live because we have mountains. And if you're familiar with the other side of the Sierra Nevada mountain range, we have here in the valley floor where it's a temperate sort of environment. Then we have those huge Sierra Nevada mountains, and on the other side of those mountains, it's actually quite deserty. It's very dry and it's desert, and that's mostly because what we call a rain shadow, where most of the precipitation that comes off the ocean gets deposited on the mountains and never really makes it back here into this dry desert area. But as it happens, there is a species, well, there's many species that follow this general rule, but there's a species of butterfly called the dog-faced butterfly. That is very closely related to a relative over on this side of the Sierra Nevadas. And this butterfly is adapted for the hot and dry climate. And over here, just like you would see on this side of the mountain range, this particular Pyralidae, you see them more in the summertime than now, I believe, is here in this more moderate climate. And what has separated them is the Sierra Nevada mountain range. Once upon a time, a very, very long time ago, those mountains were not there. And this species of butterfly was one. But over time, butterflies don't fly over the tops of mountains, or at least this one doesn't. And so we have two separate species that have arisen over time because the mountain range itself is a geographic barrier between the two of them. We also have valleys. Valleys can cause speciation, And one of my favorite valley stories has to do with, well, a canyon. And I don't know, you could think of as canyon. There's other, I have so many examples on this valley canyon stuff, but I wanted to start with a story of two chipmunks. And imagine at one time you have a plain or an area of flat land that existed. And over time, and on that area of flat land, there are two chipmunks. I should have drawn that bigger. But the two chipmunks were one. You have a species of chipmunk that lives in this area all throughout this land. It sounds kind of like a fairy tale. But then along comes a waterway, and that waterway over time has managed to cut out the land and create a canyon or a valley that has gradually over time separated this species. So we have a barrier between the two of them, and maybe originally they could have gotten across. There could have been some mixing of the gene pool, but over time this has become impossible. And this is what we see at the Grand Canyon with the chipmunks that live there. I don't know if anybody's ever been to the Grand Canyon. I've only been once, but if you have been, maybe you kind of noticed that one side of the Grand Canyon seems to be a little bit more forested than the other side, seems a little drier, a little bit more deserty. And over time, what you see is there's chipmunks that are on one side of the Grand Canyon, chipmunks on the other side of the Grand Canyon. They all used to be one species. That's verified through genetics. But today, they're quite different from each other. This one's more adapted to sort of a foresty environment with more pine trees, more ground cover and stuff like that. And the chipmunks over on this side are more adapted to the desert habitat. And, you know, they're clearly different species today, whereas they were just one species when the Grand Canyon started forming. Cities, urban areas, humans moving into spaces. What do we call that? The urbanization? Or habitat destruction can cause species to get separated from one another. And there's kind of this story, and I think I've been trying to think about a way you could do this lab where you take, and I guess when we look at India, this is India, sorta. And there was once upon a time species of tigers that lived all over India. They're everywhere. And what's happened is over time, people have moved into that environment and created cities and our agricultural areas. And what's happened to the tigers is they can't live in habitats where it's rice fields, and they can't live in habitats where there's cities. They can only live sort of in these isolated areas that were not isolated originally, because the whole area was habitat for for tigers. But over time, they've lost that habitat to urbanization. That's the formation of, you know, humans moving in and taking over the space. And so now today, the tigers are isolated in small groups in different parts of India, and their gene pools have kind of been disrupted. So they're no longer able to interbreed the way that maybe they once did. And so perhaps, and we'll see this in the lab if I figure out a way to get it done, is that you have these tigers that are becoming genetically independent from each other. So that would create a speciation event. So urbanization is something that geographically can isolate species. Rivers can isolate species, and lakes and dams and highways and oceans, highways, dams. Any kind of geographic barrier is going to prevent species from being able to share the same gene pool. So we talk about that as a form of allopatric speciation, because we have something that's come between the species, making it so they have to go off on their own. Now, I think that's where I'm supposed to end today, because if I go into sympatric isolation, we will be too far down the road. So I'm going to quit there, and I want you to answer objectives. Oh dear, I have it on the Google form that's on this thing. It's like 10 and 11 maybe. And that will be your homework for today. So get on it. And hey, you guys, it's kind of a pretty day. It's a little cold outside, but I think if you're especially feeling cabin fever, it's a good idea to get outside and breathe some fresh air and get some sunshine, because it helps. It helps kind of take away the stress of whatever's going on right now. So get on it, and we'll go back to this tomorrow.